Hello and welcome to the Tech Mojo. This is Nilan, and today in this video we will see how to use Flyway to manage your database migrations from your Spring Boot application. When you are working with a database, managing your database schemas are always a challenging task. If your application is new, then you might have a simpler schema to manage, but as your application grows and more features are added, then your schema becomes difficult to maintain. Now, this is where the Flyway comes to rescue. For managing your database migrations in the Java world, we have two choices. You have Flyway and Liquibase. Both of these tools are quite powerful and they makes it easy to maintain your database schema. And also you can version control your database schema for your application. So today in this video, we will dive into Flyway. We will look into all the different configurations that you need to do to use Flyway from your Spring Boot application. So let's jump straight in. Flyway has the support for almost all sort of popular database available in the market. It has the support for Oracle, MySQL Server, MySQL, Amazon RDS, Aurora DB, PostgreSQL, MariaDB, you name any database and it has the support available. Now let's look into how the Flyway migrations work. Any changes to the database are considered as migration. Flyway supports two types of migrations. It has the support for version migration and repeatable migrations. The version migrations are the most common type of migrations, and they are applied once in the order that you define. The most common use case for the version migration are when you have the database schema changes for creating a new table or altering an existing table or dropping the data or you're changing the index of an existing table, then version migration is used. Flyway follows a specific naming convention for your migration files. And if it is a version migration, then we need to use a prefix. And the prefix normally stands with the V, capital V, and then you can give the version number. And then you will have a separator. Separator is normally two underscores. And then you can give a descriptive name for your file. And then there is the suffix. Flyway supports two types of migration schema scripts. You can do either through SQL script or through the Java code. SQL is pretty easy to maintain. The second kind of migration files are called repeatable migration. The repeatable migrations, as the name indicates, are reapplied every time there are changes. And repeatable migrations are normally useful for managing your views or stored procedures or any sort of bulk data updates where the latest version should replace the previous one without considering the versioning. Again, for the repeatable migrations, we need to follow a certain naming convention, and the prefix used for repeatable migration is R, and you don't need to specify any version number because, as I said, repeatable migration doesn't need to be version. And repeatable migrations are always applied at last. Okay, so first it will apply all the version migration based on the version number and based on the order that you define, and then it will execute the repeatable migrations. So when you start your application with an empty database, then Flyway will first create a schema history table. And this table is used to track the state of your database. Okay, so any migration that you apply, it will keep track of all the migrations that applied so that it knows what migration need to be applied when you run the next time. So once the Flyway schema history table is created, it then scans through your class path to find all the migration files you have created. And then the migrations are then sorted based on their version number. And based on the version number, it will then apply in the order they are defined. As each migration files are applied, the schema history table will be updated and it will keep track of all the migrations that is executed on your database. So now let's jump into our Spring Boot project. We will see how we use Flyway in combination with MySQL database for managing our database migrations. To keep the video short, I have created a Spring Boot project using Spring Initializer. And this is a simple project which has a controller called Movies Controller. And within the Movies Controller, we have defined a mapping to the endpoint API 1.0/movies. And when you go to this 1.0/movies endpoint, we have one method called getMovies. And within the getMovies method, we are getting the list of all movies within our database. And within the model package, we have three classes. We have a class called movie, and this is a entity type of class. And as you can see, it has a bunch of fields like ID, title, headline, language, region, all sort of things. Okay, and here I'm using ID as my primary key, and this ID field will be automatically generated by JPA. Again, I have another class called actor, and the actor has a first name, last name, and ID. Similar story here. The actor ID will be auto-generated, and it is a primary key. So basically, we are going to create two tables, one for storing your movies details, and second one for storing the actor details. And then we have a simple JPA repository called movie repository. And within the movie repository, we are not doing anything fancy, just a simple interface that extends the JPA repository. Now let's look into our application properties. And within the application property, I have the database connection details, things like the database URL, username, password, and the driver. And the last thing here is so SQL. It's basically to print all the SQL queries being made from my application. So it will print in the log. Now let's look into our pom.xml. And within the pom.xml, I have a couple of dependencies. So the first one being the Spring Boot Startup Web. Because I'm creating a REST controller, I'm using the Spring Boot Startup Web. And then I'm using the Spring Boot Starter JPA. And then I have the MySQL connector. This is standard stuff. So if you want to work with your MySQL database with JPA, then these two dependencies are required. And then I'm using the Lombok dependency. This is completely optional. I'm using this to reduce the boilerplate code. But if you are happy to make the getters and setters yourself, then you don't need Lombok at all. Now for Flyway to work, we need to add a couple of dependencies. The first one being the Flyway core, and then we need to add Flyway MySQL. Okay, so let's find the Flyway core in the Maven repository. The latest version is 10.11.1. Let's pick that up. And similarly, we also need Flyway MySQL. Again, the latest version of Flyway MySQL is 10.11.1. The next thing we need is we need to add the changelog files, right? So the actual SQL file that is used to generate your tables and schemas. The changelog files can be created within your resources directory. So let's create a directory first called DB. And within the DB, let me create another directory called migration. Okay. And within the migrations, we will create a bunch of migration files. So the first one, we want to create a migration for our movies table. So let's create a version migration. So we'll do v1 with a separator. Then let's say add movies table. Okay, and the suffix is going to be SQL because we are writing the SQL script here. I have the SQL script for my movies table, so let me copy the SQL script from here. And that's it. So now we have created a SQL script that will add the movie table. Now let's create another migration file for actors. Again, let me copy the SQL script here. Now with these two migration scripts, we are good to go. Now before we apply these migrations, we need to define certain configurations within our application properties file. So here we need to first enable Flyway. Okay, so let's make it true so that Flyway will start working. And the next one we need is we also need to tell where our migration files are. Okay, so flyway.locations, and here we need to specify class path and then db/migrations. Okay, so with these two, we are good to go. Now, when I start my application, Flyway will automatically kick off, and then it will start looking through all the migrations files present in my class path, and then based on the order they are defined, it will start executing them and create those tables. Now, before I run this application, let me show you how this works. So I'll go to my database and let's refresh this. Okay, so as you can see, I have a very empty database, nothing exists at the moment. Now let's run this application. Okay, so there are no errors. Now let's look into the logs, what it says. So if you look into the logs, it says this is our database connection, and it successfully validated to migrations, and then it started creating those tables as defined in our schema. Okay, now let's go back to the database and refresh here. As you can notice, we have created a bunch of tables. The first one being the Flyway schema history. Let's look into the content. Now here there are 2 migrations that was executed. And then let's look into our table, like the actor table. Okay, so we have ID, first name, last name. And in the movies table, you have ID, title, headline, all the fields that we have defined. Now, one thing we have not defined is in my movie table, I have a many-to-many relationship with the actor. Okay, so this relationship is not yet defined within our database. For that, let us create another migration script, and let's call this as V3. Okay, and in the V3, we'll say add movie actor relationship. Okay, so we created another migration script, and here we will use the relationship between movies and actors. Okay, that's it. Now let's run this application. You can see another table being created. Go back to the database. Okay, so as you can see, movie actor table has been created, and it has the actor ID and movie ID. Okay, now let's look into our schema history table. Now one more row is added, and that is for adding the movie actor relationship. Now so far our application is running fine, but our database has empty data. It doesn't have any data. Now let us create another migration file, and we will pre-populate some data with that migration file. Okay, so let's call this as v4 insert test data.sql. Again, for that, I have a script over here. So let me copy the script. That's it. Now let's run this application. Oh, I made it V3. Okay, so we cannot do V3 because you see there are 2 V3s. So now let's rename this to V4. Okay, so let's run this again. Okay, looks good. Our application is running fine, and let's look into our database now. Okay, so we have some sample data being inserted, same with the actor as well as my movies actor table. Now for the demonstration, I've already created a controller, and this controller gets the list of movies available in our database. So now that we have some test data, let's run this application, and we will go to the browser and start hitting that endpoint. Okay, so let's call localhost 8080 and then API 1.0 movies. So now as you can see, the test data that we inserted is now returned through the API endpoint. Now, so far we have created the version migration, but let's create a repeatable migration. Now for the repeatable migration, the migration script file will be prefixed with R. And here let's say create replace movies view. Okay, so it's just a random view that I'm creating. And again, I have a SQL script for that. Let me take it. Okay, now again, it looks good. Let's go to our database. Now, as you can see, the movie view has been created. And if you look into the schema history, it has 5 entries. And as you can see, because this is a repeatable migration, it doesn't have a version number stored in your database because it doesn't have one. So this is how the Flyway works when you are starting with an empty database. But how do you deal with it when you already have an application with some data inside your database and later you want to integrate with the Flyway? Okay, if you want to do that, you can also do it. And for that, you need an additional configuration. Now let's go back to our application property. Here we need to give Flyway baseline. So let's say Flyway baseline on migration. And for that, we need to make it true. And similarly, you can also configure whether to validate or not validate migrations. And you can do that. Flyway validate. Okay, so validate on migration is true. Okay, so you can enable or disable the validation of your migration files when you're running your application. Now, what happens when you applied a migration, but due to some reason that migration was not good, and now you want to revert or undo that migration? So if you want to reverse or undo a migration, you can do that in Flyway, but that feature is limited to the commercial license of Flyway. You can't do that with a free version. Okay. However, there is a workaround, and the workaround is you need to create a new migration script, and within the new migration file, you can undo what you have done previously, and then you execute the migration. That way it will reverse it. So there is no straightforward way to revert or undo a migration unless you are on the commercial license. But if you are using the community or free version of Flyway, the only option for you to revert the migration is to create a new migration and undo the changes within your SQL script. So this is how you integrate Flyway within your Spring Boot project. Flyway also comes with a Maven plugin, and using the Maven plugin, we can manage the database migrations from the command line. It basically provides 7 Maven goals to achieve this. So you can use Flyway baseline, Flyway clean, Flyway info, Flyway migrate, repair, undo, and validate. So except for the Flyway undo, all other commands are available in the free version, but for undo, you have to use the commercial or the licensed version of the Flyway. Now let us see how to integrate Flyway Maven plugin within our Maven project. So to integrate this, we need to go to our plugin section, and here we need to add a new plugin. And the group ID for the plugin will be org.flywaydb, and the artifact ID will be Flyway Maven plugin. And then we need to supply a version number. So the version number currently is 10.10.0. For the Flyway Maven plugin to work, we also need to supply certain configurations. So we need to tell about our database, things like the database URL, the username, and the password. So you can supply that using the configuration tag. And within the configuration tag, we can supply URL. And then we can use our user and password. You can also supply the path where your migration changelog files are. So let's do that. You can do that through the locations, and the values are the same. You can copy it from the application properties. So for the URL, let's copy this. And for the user, let's make it root and password. And for the locations, we can use the same thing, like we can use class path db/migrations. Now this is all we need to do. Let's go to the command line and we'll try to execute the Flyway migrate command. Now from the command line, we can use mbnw. Okay, so now this one is successful, but it did not apply any migration because our database already has the latest migration. It's already in sync, so that's why it did not do anything. But now let's delete all this data, so make it a clean database. So now that our database is empty, let's test it again. Okay, so as you can see, it first created the schema history table, and then it applied all the migrations that we have in our changelog file. Okay, so as you can see, all the change logs are applied and also the test data is populated. Now this works fine, but one thing here is this is not a best practice to use the username and password hard-coded within your pom.xml file. Okay, so the best option is you can supply those username and password as a command line argument. And in order to do that, we need to define two properties within our pom.xml file. So let me add two properties here. So I'm adding database.username. And here you don't need to use the actual username because that will be passed through the command line. But here let's keep it something like your test username. Similarly, let's create the password as well. So here we are using the test username and test password. And obviously this is not going to work. And we will override this username and password through the command line arguments. So let's use that here instead of the hard-coded value for the username. Let's use from the properties. So we use database.username and similarly remove the password here and use database.password. So this is all you need to do. Now let's rerun our command again. And before I do that, let me delete my database so that I see what happens. Now let's first run it without passing any username and password. Okay, so it obviously failing because it cannot authenticate to my DB with this test username. Now let us rerun this by passing the username and password from the command line. So for that, we can here pass database.username and that will be root. Similarly, you can also pass the password database.password. That will be password. Okay, so now as you can see, the database migrations are applied and you can see that reflecting on our database as well. So this is how you can set up the Flyway Maven plugin from your Spring Boot project. This is all for today. If you like this video, please give a thumbs up and share with your friends. If you have any questions, please let me know in the comment section below. I'll be happy to answer as soon as possible. Thanks for watching and see you in the next one.